Anyway, in any case, I'm going to begin. I really don't know how that happened. Come at me if it was you. So in today's webinar, what we're going to look at is Zionism. And the idea of this is going to be split basically into 2 or 3 parts, depending on how we look at it. The first part is going to be kind of like the brief history of Zionism. We're going to do a bit of definitions and brief history and stuff like that. We're going to do like a long history. We're not going to do just from like the 1890s to 1948. But you should know, by the way, we're not going all the way into the state of Israel. We're going to stop at, at 1947, 1948. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a few different models, like educational models or frameworks that you might be able to use when talking about Zionism with young people. Now, I apologize if I talk like too much about camp or too much about tour. I'm going to try and make it like generalizable. And I hope that you can kind of find stuff in here that's relevant to the activities you'll be doing or the young people you'll be working with this summer. And like with the other webinar, one of the big aims of this is about bringing people up to like a standard across the board where they can kind of reliably understand Zionism. So with no further ado, it kind of starts with like a brief history, but actually just before that, I want to look at these 2 definitions. On the left, by the way, this is the screen with the most text. Everything else has almost no text. It's almost all pictures. But just so you know, like on the left, you've got your like dictionary definition. It's the Oxford Living Dictionary, and I think one of the key things to look at here is so I'm going to read it out. It says a movement for originally the re-establishment of a Jewish nation and what is now Israel, and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation and what is now Israel. And I think that is, in a sense, that's one of the fundamental differences about modern Zionism that I think is really interesting in like an educational framework. I don't know if any of you saw my like Young Zionist piece the other week. I don't mean you had to or anything, but I think there's this real grappling in youth movement worlds and in places like the community that we're part of about whether Zionism is all about Herzl and it's about this never-ending dream and it's about this ideal land, like a utopia, or whether it's, in like to use an Israeli word, whether it's like tachlis, whether it's like let's stop dreaming, let's stop talking about ideas and let's actually get down to business. How do we develop and protect this country? Maybe that's the difference between, like, I don't know, they're both ideological. I think that's one of the key differences. So that's kind of what we're going to look at today, and we're going to explore that in like different things. I also, I think one of the like weaknesses of the definition though is it's very much like a political thing. It's about a Jewish nation and what is now Israel, which is why I put on the other side of the screen 2 covenants, which for me express kind of like the birth of Zionism. You have like the covenant, the like Abrahamic covenant. So it's go from your land to the land that I will show you, i.e. to the land of Israel, and I'll make you a nation there. And I think one of the interesting things that this is, for Jews to read the Torah every year, to read the Torah every Shabbat morning in a different part of the story, the like way towards the early bit of the story when we're finding out like the beginning of what it is to be Jewish and the first Jew, it's about becoming a nation. And I think that's a fundamental part of like the Jewish faith, Jewish peoplehood, that I think people often fail to understand is the idea of Jewish nation. And then later, just 2 generations later with Jacob, who then gets renamed Israel, the ground on which you are lying, I will assign to you and to your offspring. And one of the things that I think is really interesting here is we're talking already about different things. So we spoke a bit about politics before. In a sense, this is religion because it's all about, sorry, I'm just going to check that everyone's, Joe, you don't need to reply, but can you message Dalia a link to the webinar? She can't get access to it. Thanks. So, and this covenantal thing, either you can say this is God and it's the promised land and it's true, i.e. like a religious thing, or you can take more of like a historical view. That if Jews read this every, like once a year for like in the different parashot for 3,000 or 2,500 years, there's going to come a point where they just start to believe it anyway, whether it's true or not. So they take the God out of it, and it just becomes, hang on, what's central in the Jewish culture and in the Jewish, like in Jewish faith, is about place. This idea of place, and in particular that place being Jerusalem. Okay, great. Laura's here. She just messaged everyone. That's good to know. So we're just going to move on. So that's the bit at the beginning about definitions. I just want to do this long history thing. And the reason I want to look at it a little bit is because I think one of the things that's interesting about Zionism is I want to have this understanding of the Jewish nation. So in this early biblical period, we start to have Jewish faith, and we start to have Jewish people, but it's primarily tribal. Different people in different kind of tribes or sects of Judaism had different practices. They lived in and across the Holy Land, like the land of Israel, but very much I think their primary geographical response to the land was not necessarily a Zionist one. They didn't see themselves as belonging to one nation. These were multiple tribes who had slightly different beliefs, sometimes slightly similar beliefs, and who could experience that in different ways in different parts of the country. And I think one of the interesting progressions is when you get here, this is, the 1,000 years, in the 1,000-year period leading up to basically Jesus, and I think that's when you get the shift in the modern era. But in that 1,000-year period, this is an interesting date, 701 BCE. At this point, you have two kind of Jewish kingdoms. You have a kingdom of Israel, and you have a kingdom of Judah. And the kingdom of Israel has its capital in Samaria, and the kingdom of Judah has its capital in Jerusalem. They're both attacked. The kingdom of Israel, i.e. Samaria, or Shomron, that falls. The kingdom of Judah, in a sense, sources differ. It's too long ago to know for a fact. But what most people think is that Jerusalem, as its capital city, was held under siege for a period of weeks or months. It's unclear. And eventually they kind of fight off the aggressors and keep Jerusalem. And I think really it's from the birth in that period of this idea of identity in the kingdom of Judah that we really get this idea of a Jewish nation today. I think that's the group of people that we kind of have to watch out for then what becomes Zionism. We'll skip a large chunk, a couple of hundred years. Really, another thing that I think important to understand about Zionism is it comes hand in hand with exile. I think for this period, as long as the Judeans or the Jews, as long as they're a nation living in Jerusalem, they don't really need to have that much of a relationship with it. It's just home. During the Babylonian exile, they get kicked out. It's really interesting. Still at this point, it's worth bearing in mind, a lot of Judeans or Jews, depending on what you want to look at them as, were probably fairly working class and farmers. It's not the case that they all got up and left and went to Babylon, but the middle classes and aristocracy, they were led up to Babylon. And that, by the way, is where we get the whole kind of on the rivers of Babylon there I sat and wept, Jerusalem, if I forget thee, let my right hand wither and my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. So I think in that period you get this first time you're taking the intelligentsia, the middle and upper classes, out of Judea, out of Jerusalem. You take them up to Babylon, and they start to produce there this real culture of return, this real culture of exile. And so in that sense, that's I think a big Zionist thing. It's really interesting as well, by the way, this exile only really lasts a couple of generations. Again, it's unclear on the exact dates, but within 3 or 4 generations later, most of these people are back living in Judea, and they're forming part of, at this point, what becomes very clearly a Jewish nation. And it's one that, in the building of the Second Temple, stands for a fairly long period of time, actually, just until after Jesus is born, so in 70 CE. In the little picture there is the relief of the Arch of Titus, which Joe Wolfe knows all about, of course. And you can see there the image being depicted. It's the Romans' victorious arch, and they're depicting this successful sacking of Jerusalem. And I think it's from the second defeat of Jerusalem that you get the start of the second exile. And I think this is really the beginning of what we consider today the Jewish culture that we feel part of. The Jews who left Palestine at the time, they go to France, Germany, Russia, and the Balkans, and they become an Ashkenazi culture. Some go to Spain and Portugal, and there they become kind of a Sephardi culture. And many go to North Africa and Middle East, and they become a Mizrahi culture. And I think in this period that ends up lasting almost 2,000 years, I think as we all know, this is when we really understand the beginning of an actual narrative of Zionism that becomes a fundamental part of what it means to be Jewish. What do I mean by that? Let's have a look. if you look over the next 2,000 years afterwards, our whole culture as Jews is focused on a place. It's an interesting question, by the way, and I think worth bearing in mind for you and also when you're around young people this summer. In all of these things, next year in Jerusalem, if I forget the O Jerusalem, are people really thinking about Jerusalem as a real place, or does it become an idea? And I would say in both cases, whether it's a place or an idea, it's the one fundamental part of Jewish culture that basically after the fall of that second temple, it kind of fills that place that had been there by sacrifice. So the sacrifice disappears, Jews start to go different places and they pray in different ways. They say the Amidah 3 times a day and they pray for the ingathering of the exiles, they pray for the rebuilding of Zion. And I think what's interesting about this slide, it's kind of all the major life events as well become connected to Jerusalem. So religious people, for example, when they build their house, they leave like a little square blank, no paint or no plaster or anything like that. And the idea is, how can we complete our house? Our home is not complete without like Jewish sovereignty over Jerusalem or without the like third temple. The same goes for the like smashing a glass at a wedding. Even in our joy, we must remember some sort of like destruction of temple. And I think it becomes like a primary part. In a sense, it's inherited trauma. I think one of the really interesting ways to look at this actually is the like little paragraph of the Talmud that kind of gives directions for how you should pray. And this is written, like after the fall of the temple. And it says, if you're in the land of Israel, face Jerusalem. If you're outside the land of Israel, face the land of Israel. If you're in Jerusalem, face where the Holy of Holies, where the old city was. If you're in the old city, face where the Holy of Holies was. I think when you have a whole people and a whole nation who are kind of orienting themselves around one physical space and who share a belief in one metaphysical idea, that's where you really get the birth of like the Zionism, I think, that we know today. So I'm going to skip a long chunk right up to almost the modern era. This little kind of map you can see here is anything that's kind of like light yellow is early, and anything that's red is late. And this is from 1789 to 1930. And what we're seeing here, so like we're covered, this was the period of like this was the period of 2,000 years, right, of like exile. Just as this exile comes to an end in Europe, you start to get the creation of nations. Now, imagine just before this map starts telling any story, there was no real such thing as Germany. You had a state called Prussia, where people spoke German, and you had Bavaria, where people spoke German, and other places. The same goes for Italy. Italy had Rome and Naples and different principalities and different kind of small kingdoms. They all spoke Italian. And even if you look at Austria-Hungary there, they're not nation states yet. That's an empire. Like Austria-Hungary, and that's why you have like the emperor. I think what happens in this period is, with a number of different revolutions and stuff in Europe, you begin to get France first in 1789 says liberty, equality, fraternity. We are also a nation state, and that gives Jews an interesting question, because until this point, I think Jewish people in Europe have belonged to the Jewish nation. Because there was no others. You could have Jewish nationality in Italy. You could have Jewish nationality in Germany. It wasn't important. But I think as this process happens, you begin to see Jews also take on their European nationality for the first time. The French Revolution was first, so they're like liberty, equality, fraternity. You can join our club. You can become full French citizens. Some Jews had to kind of renounce their Jewish nationhood in order to do that. Some did, some didn't. That's kind of besides the point. But this is, in a sense, this is like the anti-Zionism. This is saying not just in that period was there loads of anti-Semitism, was there a Spanish Inquisition, was there the pogrom in York, was there pogroms in Eastern Europe, but also just towards the end of these 2,000 years, in this kind of couple of hundred years, the Jews begin to be given the choice: would you like to assimilate and join our nation? Leave your nation behind, join our nation. So this is when we get to like the Zionist story that we know today. This is a artist's impression of like Theodor Herzl, who founded like what we think of as the Zionist movement. And this goes right back to the definition at the beginning. This is much more kind of like definition Zionism. What we're seeing here and what we begin to see, he sets up the first Zionist Congress in 1897. He was actually a playwright. That was his like principal trade. And according to what people said, not a very good one either. Like he didn't have any like major hits. Zionism was something you can tell in his diaries. Whenever one of his plays did badly, he would then like throw himself back into the Zionist cause. And I think he really also wanted fame. He wanted to be a successful person. And you really see that in his diaries. Before he meets the Ottoman Sultan, for example, he gets very, very excited about it. And then afterwards almost falls into this like weird kind of depression because it had given him so much drive until that point. That's besides the point. In 1897, First Zionist Congress. And I want to encourage you also to think that like in this period of the First Zionist Congress, the question on the table is really easy. It's not about what kind of country we want. It's not about where we want it. It's actually just let's put out some letters to people in Vienna, Paris, Basel, places like that, Western Europe, like intellectual bourgeois people, Jews, and say, hey, do you generally idea with the Jewish state? Generally agree with the idea of a Jewish state? Sorry. Later on, in other Zionist congresses, the questions get much more complicated. And those complicated questions are the questions we're living today. But like I think in this early period, it was just about general agreement. And I think, by the way, that like it kind of did, this is sort of what cements Herzl's role as being, in a sense, like the father of the state. I mean, he was interred, he was like dug up and buried in Israel in Har Herzl. And I think the like symbolic presence of him in Israel is very large because he kind of appealed to many sides of the Zionist argument. By the way, fairly modern, the Zionist Congress, not the first one, but the second one in 1898, women were allowed to vote. And it was one of the few national councils or representative bodies where women could vote. I think New Zealand was first, maybe one other, and then the Zionist Congress. So in a sense, a fairly modern kind of new sort of national assembly. And famously after the first one, he says at Basel, I founded the Jewish state, writes in his diary or whatever. And it's really interesting that, I don't know, I think that's really interesting. Also over this period, you begin to see, this photo is from the wrong period, but you begin to see waves of aliyot, of immigration. And I just want to, I'm not going to talk about all of them at any great length, but I just want to like draw your attention to two. So the first aliyah is really interesting. It's the idea of the farmer's aliyah. That's where we get like really, really the very foundations of the yeshuv, of Jewish settlements in Palestine becoming like almost acting as a nation in Palestine. There's no real infrastructure for that yet. So mostly they go into agriculture. What's really interesting is so far we've spoken mostly about a European phenomenon, like particularly in terms of like the movement of Zionism. But also during the time of the first Aliyah, a whole load of Yemenite Jews moved to Israel, moved to Palestine. And the reason why is the Ottoman Empire had recently gained control of Palestine, allowing them free access from one to another, free movement from one to another. And they had a religious figure in their community who was into something like, it was one of those like Messiah things. They thought he was a Messiah, they all followed him to Palestine. So it's really interesting, for two completely separate reasons, you start to get convergence on Palestine around that same period from both East and West. The other interesting aliyah to think about is the second aliyah, and this one's where you get the real establishment and strengthening of the moshavim, the collective farms and the kibbutzim that we know about. Oh, I got a message in the chat. Sorry, everyone, I can't. Yes, Peter's right. The trigger for the early first aliyah was about the Russification of Russia. Interesting, the second one is also to do with Russia. So if you look at the dates of the second one, it's 1904 to 1914. 1904 is also the date of a failed revolution in Russia. A whole lot of Jews who had kind of allied their hopes of becoming full citizens were like fairly aligned with the revolutionary cause. When it failed, a lot of them got up and came to Palestine as well. And here you get this real establishment of new towns, villages, kibbutzim, moshavim, and stuff like that. And in a sense, I think of it as, whether it's true or not, but I think of it as like the most ideological of the different aliyot. Anyway, out of Palestine again for a second, let's go back to Europe. You get the 6th Zionist Congress in 1903, which I think is really interesting to talk about with young people because it opens up a whole load of questions. One of the key questions on the floor at the time was basically, do we need the Jewish state to be in Palestine, or can we settle on East Africa? People know it's the Uganda plan, even though I guess today it's probably more likely Kenya, that patch of land. And it really split the Zionist Congress. They even sent out a group of people to kind of scout the land out. I think it's really interesting because it draws on some of the key questions about Zionism and about what are the beliefs that underpin it. And is it just about finding a safe haven for Jewish people in Europe? Or was it about creating some sort of genuine, like productive, thriving future that was connected to Jewish culture and beliefs and history? I'm going to do this bit quite quickly, but I just want to drag you, just so that you can understand the leap from these, like this early Zionist period to 1948. These next two things are kind of very linked. The first one's the Balfour Declaration. It's the first time a prominent Western European government with like a fair amount of power, remember Britain was like an empire at this time, recognizes the Zionist cause. And the reason why this is important is because 6 years later, they take over the land under a mandate. And they recognize in their mandate their commitment 6 years previously that when they leave, they'll hopefully allow a Jewish state to be established. It's not all song and games in that times. I mean, there's a whole kind of period where there's immigration, there's different like tax placed on the immigration of Jews because it was changing very quickly, the demographic landscape of Palestine. The 1930s and the issue of is really interesting. You have this like real kind of three-way tension between the Brits in control, a lot of Arabs in small villages who felt threatened by the new coming Jews, and Jews who wanted to see the Brits and Arabs, or at least the Brits, leave to be able to establish a state there. And also in that period, you get the real creation of these underground units, like Lehi and Irgun. I guess you might know them. I mean, they went on in a way to become what we know of as the IDF today. They were also deeply divisive. Some of the tactics they used, if we take them in isolation today, we might have more problem with. And I guess the most obvious example is the bombing of the King David Hotel. A lot of British soldiers and their, you know, in a sense, wives and families, I think it was fairly old-fashioned that way, used to hang out there. It was very like European and nice. There was a large bombing. And it was the idea was it's about like, making the Brits hurry up and leave. The last thing I don't really want to talk about in too much detail because I think it's both dangerous to talk about with young people, but potentially interesting in the right environment is the Holocaust. I don't think that it's inherently linked to Zionism, but I do think that if you look at like the international picture in 1945, 1946, 1947, it makes the case against Zionism fairly inarguable. So I don't think it really, I mean, it did make fundamental changes for Jews, of course. And it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of Jews who then moved to Palestine in that era were like displaced persons. They didn't have citizenship of any country. But I think it's a dangerous thing to talk about. I don't know, I find it tricky to talk about. I'm just gonna move on. So that's, I think, the whole story. The next little chunk, I'm just going to go over, I think, what I would consider, at least growing up in and around youth movements, as being the classical approach to understanding Zionism. And it's all through 5 streams. And I'm going to talk about a 6th one as well. Here's an example for you. I haven't filled it in. So we're going to get the example of what it's called. We're going to get who they were. And then we're going to try and answer 3 questions, really. Why do they believe in a Jewish state? Do they think it has to be in Israel? And if so, why? And what would they like the state to look like? And just, I'm going to add to that little pictures around the side that will illustrate, hopefully, what these movements might look like today, or a picture of who founded it, or what youth movement they might be associated with, things like that. So just try and bulk out that context so you understand it a bit more. This is very, very quick. This is very much the overview. But I think if we were doing this 5 years ago, this would be the only model we were looking at. Hopefully, I'm going to give you this, and then I'm going to give you some more interesting models afterwards. And this is fun to do with young people, and you can dress up in characters and have good debates and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong. I just think sometimes we talk too much about these, like, long dead people. But here we go. The first one's political Zionism. I've illustrated it up in the top with that Der Judenstaat. It's like the Jewish state. It was Herzl's pamphlet. He then went on to write Alt Neuland. It was like more of a novel about this utopia. Political Zionism, let's say, why does it believe in a Jewish state? Fundamentally, it's all about self-determination to survive. But just to be clear, it's not just about surviving anti-Semitism. I think for political Zionists, a big part was also surviving assimilation. What if in France and in Germany, the Jews just carried on and they became happy citizens of those countries? Political Zionism was trying to stop that as well. It was about creating a Jewish political nation. So yes, it is about survival, but it's not just the survival we think about. And interestingly enough, Herzl doesn't necessarily, because the key is about survival, he doesn't necessarily believe it has to be in the historic land of Israel. He mostly does, don't get me wrong, and I think most political Zionists also do. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that the main thing here is about surviving as a self-determining kind of nation state. That's the one we all kind of know. If we move on, the next one is Labour Zionism. So I've illustrated it with a little like Habernim draw logo, because I guess another way for Labour Zionism, also Socialist Zionism, and the picture of its kind of spiritual leader and founder, A.D. Gordon. When we think about Israel today, and this is definitely something we can talk about on hikes and stuff on Israel Tour, and we can even talk about it on camp as well in terms of like immersing ourselves in Israel. One of the big cultural things is hiking. I mean, at this time of year, like 2 weeks before Pesach, when everyone's on holiday in Pesach, everyone goes up north and they go and hike in Banyas, and they hike because there's a real connection there between this, what is considered work, i.e. we're going to sweat and we're going to put our sweat into this land, and the land itself, i.e. the land that we're walking on. And Labour Zionism was all about like having this idea of building a socialist project in Israel that was going to be based on hard work and equality. And that project itself was going to reinvigorate people. The reason it's like specifically in the land of Israel is because it was going to be a more exciting project for people to get behind. We're not just going to go try and make a Jewish like Bund somewhere, like a Jewish sort of like socialist settlement in Russia, but no, we're going to go back to where we came from, and we're going to create there this like incredible ideal society. I think that was how it was sold to people. And some movements, if you think of like Habernim Draw, it's still kind of, that's very much their like guiding principle. Cultural Zionism is Ahad Ha'am. He was born Asher Ginsberg, I think, not to be confused with Asher Goldberg. I think the general idea is really well summed up in that quote there. What's a Jewish state? So a state for the Jews is one thing. It's just a state. It could look like France. It could look like the UK, where Jews go and they can vote and they can live like anyone else. And that's the criticism of the Herzl thing. It's just a political body filled with Jews. Ahad Ha'am's thing, on the other hand, was let's make it a Jewish state where everything about it was, kind of bathed in a culture of Jewish learning, of Jewish shared experience, of a Jewish faith, of Jewish writing. And really, you have this kind of spiritual or cultural revival or renaissance here that's being pitched at people. We don't just want to go somewhere and survive. That we could do anywhere. But if we go back to the home that we are kind of born of and that we pray about and we talk about and we've always made all our culture about, if we go back there, that's where we can like spiritually and culturally thrive. So that's the big pitch in cultural Zionism. The next one is the B'nai Akiva one. It's religious Zionism. You've got there the picture of Rav Kook. Here you kind of have two different things. So on I think the mainstream one is probably the idea that actually returning to the land of Israel is a Jewish responsibility, and that there's several mitzvot that relate solely to how Jews perform their work in the land of Israel, about kind of leaving sabbatical fields, or a lot of things about agriculture, about like the land of Israel itself. I think the second point is, if we look even further into it, and I don't think this was necessarily always the case, but in different cultures it's more prominent. You also have this element of like messianism, or like, this idea that if Jews go back there and perform mitzvot in their and create a place that can welcome the Mashiach will come sooner. That was the idea as well. Now I think today that it's hard to know where the split lies today. I think more of it is just about the pure religious connection to the land. But here the Israel bit is definitely, it's non-negotiable. A lot of these mitzvot can only take place on that certain patch of land. And so the Uganda plan, for example, wasn't courting much favor amongst religious Zionists. By the way, an interesting discussion to have with young people about religious Zionism is it's like a brief aside, but it's about the Hatikva, the national anthem. And one of the Zionist Congresses, they're like, oh, we need a flag, we need an anthem, stuff like that. One camp wanted the anthem to be like Shir HaMa'alot, which is like a religious psalm that we sing in Grace After Meals. Another camp wanted it to be Hatikva. And I think in a sense, you have this real split here. By the way, it's not always the religious people who wanted, in quotes, the religious thing. In the sense that could have been profane if they were misusing it. But you have this real tension here, even in this early period, between, is it being based on like a Jewish people and a Jewish nation, or is it coming out of Jewish text and spirituality and scripture? The next one is revisionist Zionism, which is kind of Jabotinsky. I couldn't think of a youth movement to go with this one, or at least not one in the UK. I know there are some around the world. I think the kind of key quote is about eliminating the diaspora, or the diaspora will eliminate you. There's a real sense in revisionist Zionism of a need for survival, and also a need for taking survival into our own hands. Now, a lot of different kind of cultural groups and Zionist groups in Israel went on to spawn different, I don't know, like youth clubs or youth groups, or even football clubs and sports clubs. And the kind of the revisionist Zionist football club, I think I'm right in saying, is Beitar Yerushalayim, which is pictured there. And there was a big thing a few years ago, and I think, you know, it kind of recurs every few years, where their fans, you know, they sing things like "Forever Pure." And this idea of like Jewish purity. In a sense, it's like the most. I don't want to like put them on a spectrum of right wing or left wing. In a sense, it's the most kind of right wing of the like Zionist models that we're looking at.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that Beitar is also a youth movement, a big youth movement. So yeah.
Thank you. And this is a sixth one, which we never really talk about. The reason we don't talk about it, I actually don't know why. I think it's hard, you know, sometimes to understand. But I put it here for a couple of reasons. So Diaspora Zionism, its kind of pioneer, someone called Henrietta Sold. Interestingly, she set up the Hadassah organization, which we know of today as all the hospitals and stuff. When it was set up, it was like and I think still today, it's the like women's Zionist movement. So, for example, in a lot of the early days, they would fund a lot of research into, you know, how can we do maternity treatment better in Israel, for example, in the issue amongst like Jewish people in Israel. The reason there's like a special link there between that kind of Zionism and FSOY is because Hadassah have a close partnership with Young Judea. I think they might even be, Young Judea might be the youth movement of Hadassah. And Young Judea is also our kind of sibling movement in America. So in a sense, I was like, it's too good to miss this opportunity. Diaspora Zionism was not necessarily about moving to Palestine. And in a sense, it was a very much an American, it was very much something that could only have begun in America, where Jews already were like living this thriving lifestyle. In America, they thought, what do we have to give up from New York to be able to support this? So they didn't go, most of them, it was about providing political support, financial support, technical support. It was kind of a general diaspora support for the idea of Zionism. Just one last thing on this question. I think that, like I said, this is the classic model, and it looks at all these different Zionisms. I think this is and then we're going to go and do something a little bit more fun. But this is the classic model. It's all those different Zionisms. If we're being a bit critical of it, I think that all of those movements we're looking at are kind of European/Anglo-American movements. And I think one of the big silent parts of the Zionist story is about in Israel's first 20 years, when, you know, over 800,000 people, Jewish people, were kicked out of Iraq, for example, or different parts of Syria, Lebanon, Morocco, Algeria, places like that. I think that we have a tendency in FSY as well, maybe often sometimes, to not talk about like the Mizrahi experience. And I think one of the reasons we have to talk about it is because if we look at Israel today, and, you know, we're just like a week before an election, that actually it can still have a huge influence on what Zionism looks like on the ground today. Remember at the beginning, I said there's a difference. There's Herzl Zionism there, and it's all about having a belief, and it's all about, look how amazing we can be one day. It's a never-ending dream. And on the other side, you have this like real tachlis, how can we support Israel? And so great, look at the stuff we've spoken about in these like last few different examples. Like, these are all the dreams, but actually day-to-day life in Israel includes far more people than the ones we've just looked at. And how can we write their story as well? And how can we be part of that? That's done. That's the bit that I frankly think is stuff that everyone should know. And I think there's good opportunities in that to talk with young people. Just before, in the last section, I want to talk about what I think are more creative methods, not just methods, I mean like frameworks for talking about Zionism, understanding it as ourselves and with young people. Here we go. So this one I really like. Pesach is just coming up around the corner. The idea, in Pesach, you have the 4 sons or the 4 children, depending on your tradition. Why is this night different from all other nights? They each ask a question. Someone has said, well, hang on, what if we take that model of these 4 questions and 4 sons and we transpose it to different generations of Jews? So let's say it's our great-great-grandparents, our great-grandparents, our parents and us, something like that, right? And I've kind of illustrated it here. And say, what questions would they ask? And I think this is a fascinating model to understand the story of Zionism for the Jewish people. This is our great-great-grandparents. It's not mine. And they're asking, why do people hate the Jews? These are people who are living a life that they have always thought one that they've always kind of lived. There's no real idea about getting up and moving anywhere. It's just about facing anti-Semitism. We spoke a little bit before assimilation as well, but generally it's why do people hate the Jews? They go on, they have kids in the 1890s or whatever, and their kids grow up with this idea of, they grow up in youth movements with, when will Jews return to their land? So maybe we're talking our grandparents or our great-grandparents, something like that. So you've got, why do they hate us? When will we return to our land? The next generation is fortunate enough to actually have returned to their land. So we're talking now between our grandparents, our parents, depending on how old they are. But when will our land become a fertile garden? Remember, in the first 20 years of the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, people are living with rations. They're living in comparative poverty. The state is having to absorb millions of new migrants from around the world. And actually, how are we going to turn that into, we don't want it to be a displaced persons camp, we want it to grow. And you have the idea of making the desert bloom. I think that was the big question for the generation between our parents and grandparents, who very much, would always put their pound coin in the JNF box. It was all about making the land fertile. And then you get to our parents / today, when will there be peace? I think that's the key question today. It's really funny because this in some ways goes back to the split I was talking about. If you believe in Zionism as a dream, then yes, you can understand that Zionists today still care about, this next question. But if you think Zionism is just about, protecting the kind of Jewish political state as it is, then this question is still relevant. It's still a deeply important part, but we're not dreaming in the same way. And that's fine. I think it's just an important distinction to have. I think one of the challenges distinguishing between them is nowadays, you basically, everyone has to live with both of those things, both the dream and the reality. And that's one of the big challenges, both in Israel and for diaspora Jews like us. By the way, I think these are important questions to have our young people think about on our programs. I know that it feels distant to us to be asking these things now, because people are going to Herzliya with their families, and people are not seeing war all the time, and people are not seeing anti-Semitism all the time. But it's important to understand where Herzliya came from, what it grew out of before that, and about a kind of exposure to this number of different narratives that have taken place. I think grounding people in what is really their own story. Some other key frameworks for today. So this one I quite like. It's just about you take this really simple definition. Zionism believes there should be a Jewish state in the land of Israel. I don't know many people who would disagree with that. But you take it apart. You underline the key things there that have questions about them. So a Jewish state, what does that look like? Is it politically Jewish? What does that mean? Do Jews vote? Do other people vote? Other political laws guided by some sort of Sanhedrin who make the rules? Is it like a theocracy, a bit like we think of as the Islamic state, the Jewish state? Is it a religious state in terms of its practice? So this is maybe more where the theocracy example is better. Are there codes of dress? Are there codes about public transport on Shabbat? Is it a sort of culturally Jewish state? And if so, does it really matter? Can Jews be culturally Jewish in any other state, like France or New York? Maybe I would say that New York is a culturally Jewish state. And that last one is is it ethnically Jewish? And I think that one is, potentially we're very uncomfortable with, but I think it's worth asking as well. What is it that is a Jewish state? And the next bit that's underlined also comes with loads of questions. The land of Israel. Well, hang on, where is the land of Israel? Is it, where it's drawn in this Bible or that Bible? And does it include, all the way up to the Euphrates and the Tigris in Bereishit? Or is it about like a, like these are like really important questions to ask, and it's one of the like big issues in Zionism is really trying to ask and understand these questions. They're interesting questions for young people as well in different language. And I think one of the good ways to explore that idea today is in the recent, almost a year ago now, the nation-state law that was passed by the Israeli Knesset. It's a basic law which makes it almost like a constitution in Israel, because Israel is the Jewish nation-state. It's a nation-state for the Jews. It says that the national language is Hebrew, the flag is this, the anthem is Hatikva, and a few other things. And I think all of those statements kind of highlight some of the key tensions and questions that I've just spoken about. The next one is by a guy called Michael Rainsbury. He said, all countries create ideas. Zionism is an idea that created a country. Now, that's a very nice phrase. I would very much welcome some young people to discuss that. But in a sense, I think it's just one of those things that sounds nice. But again, let's take it apart a bit. What is it to be an idea that created a country? And what was that idea? So was the idea the one that Herzl had? It's about surviving. Or was it the one that Ahad Ha'am had? It was about thriving. Was the idea, a political one, a religious one, a cultural one? In a sense, this definition opens up just as many questions as it does answers. It is nice, though, to think about the relationship with the idea in a country. So the obvious opposite is America has created the American dream, right? The American dream doesn't build America. America builds the American dream, right? We're all aspiring to it. But Zionism does work the other way around. So it's still an interesting discussion to have. This one's Robin Moss, who's at UGIA, who some of you will meet over the next few years in different applications for roles and stuff. This is nice. It's quite creative. You can encourage people to draw these things or write these things or have different relations. It's all very much about what does this word mean to you, that kind of thing. Basically, think about all the R words: redemption, reunion, revival, rebellion, renaissance, re-entry, return, rejuvenation. You can go on and on and on. The idea is that Zionism is all of these words, and you can ask people to debate which one they think is more. You can get them to stand on this side or that side. You can get them to draw it. You can have different pictures that you're supposed to match up with different ones. It's very much about, this one's not really about giving much content. It's about maybe at the end of all the content you've given, how can you allow the young people to express it in their own words? So you're giving them a selection of, you can go more than this, you can give them 40 R words, and they can start to pick the ones that they think Zionism is. I think that's quite good. It gives young people the opportunity to guide the conversation. This one I think is tricky because it says Zionism is the vision and venture of the Jewish people. It goes back to the idea of Zionism as firstly, it's a vision, it's a possibility rather than a reality. But then venture tells you it's the reality bit. But I think secondly, this is the idea that all the Jewish people in modern times, what do we share? Do we share our religious practice? No. Our religious belief? No. Our cultural heritage? No. And so on and so forth. What do we share is the kind of a connection to either a real or imaginary land of Israel. So either it's the real state, or it's this idea of Israel that we all hold inside our heads because that's what we are as Jews. So it's quite an interesting discussion to have, I think, with young people. So what do we have in common? And let's look at all our differences. And do you keep Shabbat? And do you keep kosher? And do you listen to Jewish music? And do you do this ritual and perform that ritual and go to a Jewish school or a non-Jewish school? No, 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 no. How do you feel about Jerusalem? Right? I think that's the rough idea of that model. The next one is, I think, fairly... the next one, some of you will have come across before. I'm going to do it quite quickly. By the way, there's just 10 minutes left. Thank you for sticking through it. The next one I'm going to do quite quickly. It looks at the line in Hatikva that says, Liot am chofshi be'artzeinu, which translates there, like to be a people free in our land. Thanks, Joe. Joe just sent me a message. So to be a people free in our land, let's look at each of those words and say, hey, what do they mean? And we can be creative with this. We can put it up on big boards. We can put it up across a campsite. We can explore it in groups or as a station rotation. I don't want to hold ourselves back with this. Hatikva also interesting for other reasons. Like, why is, not everyone in Israel is Jewish, but it has Nefesh Yehudi, or it talks about looking east. But what about the Jews who came from India who actually looked west? It's really interesting. Anyway, the 4 Hatikva questions say, let's look at these 4 words and say, what is it? So to be, what is it? Is it about survival, or is it about existence, or is it about thriving? What is it? A people, what's that? What does it mean to be a Jewish people? What if we have different beliefs and practices? What does it mean for different types of Jewish people, different tribes, in quotes, people like Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, and also non-Jewish people in the land of Israel? What's their role as people? Do we tolerate them? Do we grow with them? Are we the same as or different to them? So how can we be a people? And also, how can we be one people when we come from so many different places? Freedom is about 2 things. I think I kind of split it up. One is this idea. The first one you can see is this: we're free. How do we create? How do we move? How do we capitalize on our freedom to become free to be the people we want to be? It's like that's freedom 2. The other one's freedom from. So it's like, how can we ensure that people don't get sent to prison for what they believe, or what they say, or stuff like that? So these twin freedoms are really complicated in Israel because people have very fervent beliefs, and some beliefs really challenge the whole idea of what it is to be Jewish or Israeli. And the last one is Be'at Seinu, in our land. What's our relationship to this land? Does this relationship have a land? Does this land have a relationship to other people, etc., etc.? The land one you can go for years on. I really like that model, also because I like music, and it's a musical one in a sense. The next one is Zohar Reviv. It's about Israel's 5 lands. So Israel, at all times, it's 5 things. One is you have the land that we imagine, i.e. from Torah. Go right back to the quotes at the beginning about Abraham and Isaac. Did it happen? Who cares? It's in our imagination, right? The next one is about covenant, about promised land. So the next one is you look at prophets, someone like Zechariah. Zechariah says, men will grow old and will need sticks, i.e. like walking sticks. That's how we know they'll grow old. And children will play in the streets of Jerusalem. He's writing this from exile. So we're getting this idea of a promised land, a covenantal land. The next one you get is the remembered land. So this is how we and our great-great-grandparents dreamt, I think, of the land of Israel. Like, there we sat and wept, Jerusalem, if I forget thee. So the opposite of forgetting is remembering. It's the remembered land. Contemporarily, you have the lived land, and this is the one we're grappling with every day. And then you have this idea of a possible future, the envisioned land. That's the kind of, and so Zionism is all of those 5 things at once, which I actually think is probably the most convincing thing. And if you can get that into some education, I would be so over the moon and would really want to see the Pula, would want to see the discussion you have. Because I really think that one of the key problems we have as a Zionist youth movement is holding all 5 of those things at once, where some people will connect more to one than others. I think there's one more, maybe 2 more. I know, this is it. Just to wrap up, I just wanted to wrap up with some good questions that I could leave you and leave young people to think about, the future of Zionism. I think this would be like a nice way to finish. So the first question is obvious, like, is Zionism a never-ending ideal? Is it like, if you will, it is no dream, as Herzl said? Or are we living in a post-Zionist world, right? Like, the state of Israel exists, it's been established, job done, no need for a Zionist youth movement anymore. They're both convincing, by the way, and sometimes, I don't know, like, I change my mind every now and then. Then you have this question of, like, what does it mean, Zionism in a diaspora community? We can't vote, right? We can't go to Israel and vote. So how do we get our young people engaged in Israel? And should they feel engaged? And what does it mean if the Prime Minister of Israel turns around and says, hey, I'm speaking on your behalf, but it's like, I didn't elect him. And even in Israel, he was only elected by a minority. It's a plurality because of the weird system they have there. So who gets to choose what Zionism is and who gets to speak on behalf of it? And I think, are we even allowed an opinion about Zionism or about the state of Israel if it's not us who have kids going to the army, for example, or who are going to the army? It's like a big question in the diaspora. The next one is, let's say, outside of our community, let's look at, and this is a good question, I think, to have with older young people, so 16-year-olds on tour, is to look at anti-Zionism and Zionism in public discourse. Why is it that Zionism has become a word for Jews? Let's look at the politics of it. Let's look at the times that Zionism is or isn't, or anti-Zionism, is or isn't anti-Semitic. And also, again, even in this world, we can say, who owns the word? Like, is it for us, the Federation of Zionist Youth, to give the definition? Or is it for someone who might go and live in a settlement in the West Bank? Or is it for someone who is on a university campus in America? Or is it for a anti-Zionist Jewish group like the Neturei Karta to say, real Jews are not Zionists? It's a real difficult question, and there are so many people giving their interpretation. I think it gives us a chance to address Zionism outside of who we are. And I think it's also worth looking at Zionism in Jewish education as well. In America, in the last 20 years, you've seen America used to agree, by the way, that the thing that united all Jews was Israel. They could never go there, right? It was too far. So it was just this amazing idea. What a country. When they started going there, and in the last 20 years, their politics has changed. They've begun to, I think, particularly in like progressive Judaism, non-Orthodox Judaism, have begun to replace Zionism with Tikkun Olam. I think that's now what most American progressive Jews have in common rather than Zionism. So we can ask that question about, is Zionism Tikkun Olam? What's more important? Is it about like our, should we be more universal? What should our values be to ourselves or to the world around us? Another thing that I think is interesting, quite complicated to look at, but you can print off news articles, Instagram posts, things like that and talk about, is how do we feel about like Hasbara versus Zionist education versus kind of people who say, we're objective. Can anyone be objective? Has this been objective? It hasn't. So like things about how we perceive truth, that's very much like on the zeitgeist at the moment. It's very much about like fake news, stuff like that. And the last question is like, I think as a Zionist youth movement, is our job to look inwards and talk to Jews about Zionism, or is it to look outwards and talk to non-Jews about Zionism? By the way, I was going to give like a resources page. The place where you can find the most those, it's a big book, we've got it in the office, and you all madrachim, Joe's about to show it to you, so have a look at his screen. You're all madrachim, you're all welcome here whenever. It's called the Zionist Ideas. It's a bit chunky, you don't have to read the whole thing. If you look at a given page, you have like a bit of an example about, what's this text about, and then a bit of a quote from a text, and it gives it like a nice summary. So that, in just under an hour, is the history of Zionism, the like traditional model for looking at it, and a whole lot of, I think, creative models, methods, things like that for looking at it today with young people. And I hope you learned stuff. It's all about bringing people to like a good standard so that you can go onto our camps and tours and feel confident with it. I'll hang around for a minute if you want to chat.
Just also, sorry Josh, just also to add on to that, we've got loads of these in the office and they're really, really great resource to use for writing pulot or for whatever you want to do. So just grab one of these if you want.
Yeah, that's called A Land of Milk and Honey. It's excerpts from different pieces of like Israeli literature. We have loads in the office actually on Zionism and on other stuff, so you're always welcome. But I'm gonna hang around now, and if anyone wants to chat, then lovely. I'm gonna stop recording, so you don't have to worry.